I welcome everyone again to the conversation series and to Ahmedabad University. We are research university and we believe in different kind of education, and we also believe that ideas should come from all over the place. And for that matter, we invite people, those who are deep thinkers and policy makers, to talk to our student, to faculty, and in fact to the larger audience. And Ashish is here. We are thankful to him. In fact, we wanted to invite him in July, but he got busy and then we had to reschedule it. And thankfully, now he's back in the next year. So thank you so much, Ashish. I'll give a quick introduction. Ashish Chandorkar is a well-known name. He's a Counsellor, Permanent Mission of India to the World Trade Organization, Government of India. And he has more than 20 years of management consulting experience, advising top-tier clients across industries and geographies. He has also worked on advisory assignment with some of the large corporations globally. Uh, Earlier, Ashi's work as an entrepreneur in the digital world, he's a well-known name. He helped build and scale these enablers for India's economy, India's booming technology economy. Uh, Most of you might know, or some of you might not know, but Bharat Varta is one of his initiative. It was India's fastest growing podcast platform, bringing to life informed and long form discussions on issues of public policy, politics, and culture. We all are familiar with Smahi Foundation. He is the founder director of that. It is a public policy and research focusing on the intersection of governance, entrepreneurship, and technology. And he also founded this Yugasmita Innovations, a digital marketing for Indian startups, helping them design optimal digital media strategies. So we are thrilled to have Ashish at Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series. Thank you so much for joining us, Ashish. Welcome to Ahmedabad University.
Thank you, Sudhir, for having me and for that generous introduction. It's great, glad to be here on this platform.
Thank you so much. The person who will be in conversation with Ashish is our own Professor Pallavi Vyas. She holds a PhD in public policy from Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago. And she has worked as a consultant, and she's currently working also as a consultant with the World Bank. Before that, she worked with CPWR, where she is evaluating medical costs to workers in the construction industry in the US between 1999 and 2008. Before that, she worked as an economist in the economic litigation consulting at economic analysis at LECG Los Angeles. Before that, she worked at the Milken Institute of Santa Monica as a research analyst to the president on global economic issues. And she teaches courses in micro and macroeconomics. So thank you so much, Pallavi. Before I hand it over to you, this is just a quick introduction. Quick alert that everybody will be muted throughout the conversation, and you both will be in conversation. And people can put their questions in everybody's chat box. We'll be curating those questions, and then we'll come back to all the questions at the end of the conversation, somewhere around 5:05 to 5:10. So please take it forward from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudhir. And hi, everyone. Welcome to Ashish. And we hope to host you in Ahmedabad at some point as well in the near future. So let me begin with a couple of economics, finance questions, which, since we are from that area, let's dive right in. So I'm going to ask you a two-part question. First, is the source of funds for infrastructure a problem in India historically? Like India has borrowed from the IFC, International Finance Corporation, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, other governments. Is that kind of funding not available for India anymore, or is it still available? So any light on that would be interesting. And the second part to that same question is that recently in March of 2021, there was a bill passed in the Lok Sabha about the creation of the NABFID, which is the National Bank for Finance and Infrastructure Development. Given that this bank does develop, the curious within us ask, where will it raise its money from? Given that of the 130 crores, about 1.5 crores pay taxes, does this bank have any fiscal recourse? So any light on any of these two questions would be very helpful to us.
Sure. Thank you, Pallavi, for this conversation. Let me address the first question, and then we'll go back to the whole discussion on the NABFID. So on the fiscal side, I mean, of course, you are absolutely right in saying that financing has been a historical constraint when it comes to infrastructure development in India. And by which I mean that the budget has got a limited view of how much money can be spent on what is called the capital expenditure, or capex, which is essentially the driver of infra creation. But quite interestingly, this constraint may actually be shifting elsewhere now, which is on the execution side. Let me explain this a bit in terms of the numbers. So last year, the capex which allocation in the budget was up about 26% to 5.5 lakh crores. The budget has been going up every year actually for the last few years, but last year was a significant increase, 25% increase. Now, of course, the union budget is going to be presented shortly in about 10 days' time, and we obviously don't know the situation this year. But given that the tax revenues have been buoyant in the last few months after the second wave, so even if you assume that the same percentage increase happens as last year, say 25%, the 5.5 lakh crores can increase in outlay to about 7 lakh crores as far as the central allocation is concerned. This is just my guess. I mean, I don't have any knowledge of the actual numbers which will come out in a couple of weeks' time. But let's say the same percentage increase to 7 lakh crores. Now, if you add, say, 2 lakh crores from NAPFED, and we'll talk about the NAPFED in a bit, say about 5 lakh crores from state government capex, because they have their own budgets and own projects which they fund within the states. And finally, let's say about 2 lakh crores from investors. We actually hit about 18 lakh crores. And that is, if you see the national infrastructure pipeline, which was announced in late December 2019, but of course, later on, because of COVID, there'll be some adjustments to that program. The talk was that we will be spending about 20 lakh crores per year on infrastructure creation. So actually, we are not very far away from that number, assuming some of these the data points which I gave, they actually hold. So the fiscal constraint may actually be easing, and even without the assistance from the multilateral agencies. Of course, for specific projects, we will continue to tap into those funding. For example, for urban improvement or electric mobility or construction of irrigation projects. A lot of those funding still comes from multilateral agencies on a case-by-case basis, depending on each project evaluation and the feasibility of its completion. So actually, there may be some gap, but it can be bridged with some effort on what we really need. But now there's a different problem. The problem is that, do we have enough large projects which can absorb this financing? Again, let me give you some perspective. So if you have to absorb 20 lakh crores of financing, we may need 3 to 4 times the size of the projects on the drawing board, as only some will get clearance in a given year, right? I mean, you cannot, of course, launch all projects in the same year. So if in 1 year you have to spend 20 lakh crores, you need to have a pipeline of, say, 60, 70, 80 lakh crores worth of projects. And that's like a huge number. Also, to execute projects of that size, there's a huge process behind it in terms of approvals, land acquisition, environmental clearances, concurrence of state and local governments. And of course, you need contractors who can execute the projects at that scale. And all of this in itself can then become a bottleneck. So I would still say that it's still a better problem to have, that we may have, let's say, the access to money, but we may face execution constraints. And I think that's still a good shift of the problem, because then you move on to the next step, which is how to develop that capacity of execution in India within the government and the private sector. So that's on the first question, Pallavi, on the financing part of it. Let me go to the NAPFED aspect as well, because that's a very critical part of how things will move on going forward. So NAPFED is the National Bank for Financing Infrastructure Development, as Pallavi mentioned. Historically, the governments have been funding most public infrastructure. There may have been a few instances where the private capital had come in for specific projects, but for various reasons, it remains tougher for the private sector to completely own up the financing of a project. They can do a good job of the execution side, but not so much on the risk taking when it comes to the financial risks. And we can talk about that in the course of the conversation. But anyway, since the reasons go beyond the financial risks, so we'll keep those specific points aside for now. Now, coming to the governments, be it the central or the state governments, they all fund infrastructure from their own budgets. And as you rightly pointed out, budgets will always have fiscal constraints. We do have taxpayer bases now. I mean, this year we have had 6 crore odd returns filed. So some of course are nil returns. So the number of people who pay direct tax is still low, but at least it is increasing, at least in terms of the catchment area. But of course, it's still a small number. And we all pay GST, which is an indirect tax, which is levied on the point of sale on the consumption. So including, let's say, direct and indirect taxes, the gross tax to GDP ratio will be about 11-12%. Again, we need to see the numbers which come out in the budget. This is just my approximation. The number, of course, varies each year. We have been under 10% in the first pandemic year where things were really bad. So the larger point is that there's a fiscal constraint which is there. Now, the central budget has typically got a capex of 5 to 6 lakh crores, like it was 5.5 lakh crores last year, as I mentioned, as a general range. So, although that number has been going up, but there is a ceiling on how much the government can put money in capex. Government has to do other things also, like social programs, education, healthcare, defense, all kinds of priorities are there. There are so many different divisions and departments. So the central capex will always have a limit. Now, if government spends more, obviously it has to borrow, and that has got other macroeconomic problems when governments start borrowing more. And this is exactly where the National Bank for Financing Infrastructure Development, or NABFID, comes in. This bank is very much live. Mr. K.V. Kamath, who's an iconic figure of the Indian banking industry, he's the chairperson of the bank. In a recent media interaction, he had hinted that the bank will start its financing. It will cut its first check in the next quarter, which is the April, May, June quarter. And do note that the NABFID will not tap into the central government's budgetary processes or resources. Its job is to raise money from global lenders and investors who have the risk appetite to put money in long gestation infrastructure projects. It is also not a commercial retail bank in the sense that it's not going to open branches and ask us to put deposits directly with the bank. It is more of you can call it like a B2B arrangement, or a government to it can tap into private and public entities from different countries who are willing to put money in long tenure projects. And the challenge with infrastructure always is that you cannot have retail money sponsoring long duration projects, because all of us obviously deposit money for short duration. I mean, for a few years, but the infrastructure projects, their ROI comes after maybe even decades, not just years. So NABFID will essentially solve that problem. It will find money which is willing to wait, as it called, the patient capital. It is willing to wait for the returns, and it is willing to wait for the investments to mature, and that is how it will find its money. So in that sense, it's a interesting start, and the industry has been calling for this for a long time. And let's hope that it works well, starting very, very soon in the next quarter. Pallavi, you're on mute actually.
What about the kind of the rate of interest that this bank will provide the infrastructure projects? Is there any thought on that? Is it going to be less? Is it going to be more? I mean, is there going to be some kind of subsidy given to government projects?
Yeah, so government has infused equity in the bank. It will use that as a base capital, and using that as a leverage, it can then raise resources outside India or even within India. The rate of interest, of course, is since there'll be a lot of foreign investors, they look forward to a return which is protected in the foreign currency terms as well. But of course, these investors are not looking for market returns typically, right? So when you tap into, let's say, a pension fund, or into, let's say, a institutional investment fund, their benchmarks are different. They are looking, especially pension funds or even sovereign wealth funds of other countries. They are looking more to preserve capital with a specific view on returns, which would be much lesser than a speculative returns in equity markets, for example, right? So So yeah, you're right. The cost of financing actually goes down, and that's the biggest advantage of this bank. It's a quasi-sovereign entity in a way, right? So because this is a Government of India entity, so the expectation that the rate which they pay will of course be lower than what the commercial interest rates or commercial borrowing rates are for private entities. So in that sense, its cost of borrowing will be low, and hence it's the rate at which it lends, which will also be lower than, let's say, if the same road builder or let's say the same power plant has to raise from a commercial bank. It will get money at a lesser rate of interest from the NAFID. And I think that's the whole value proposition of this arrangement.
Right. And then these infrastructure projects are going to be held accountable in some way, right? Because they're private investors, global investors, they have to pay back, right? I mean, we don't have the moral hazard problem that we've had in the past, where you know you're going to get bailed out. So you might just continue to stay inefficient. While over here, since you have such a large infusion of private money and global money, will these infrastructure projects be held more accountable in some way?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the accountability comes at multiple levels. So for example, there's also been a change in the rules and regulations just a few months ago, where the government is talking about attracting more high quality of execution, not just L1 bids. So there has been some change to the procurement rules, which says that the government agencies which are executing these projects need not always go for the L1 bidders. I mean, that was also one of the issues which have been there in the past, where the low quality of the low cost has translated into low quality, unfortunately, right? Because the participants have not really taken a holistic view of projects. So I think that kind of issues are also being taken up. And I think another challenge which will come in is on the governance side in general. So the NAFID will has to do that due diligence in terms of who they are financing. They could be financing state government projects, central projects, or even private sector projects. So when they do the due diligence, and I think that this is where the credibility of the management of NAFID comes into play. The fact that Mr. Kamath is helming it is very critical. I mean, he actually, in fact, for those of you who don't know, like when he started ICICI was not a commercial bank to start off. It was actually a project finance institution, very similar to what NAFID will be, except that was more intended towards corporates and not necessarily public infrastructure. So in that sense, he has already built a huge organization. I mean, ICICI moved into the retail business from the corporate business much later in its history. So in fact, ICICI used to have a full form also. I forget that now, but it actually stood for something which was around, which kind of denoted the name that it was an infrastructure lending organization. So in that sense, the credibility of NAFID is what is the proxy, Pallavi, to what you say, that they have to do the due diligence of the right projects and ensure that the governance stays in place.
Okay, this is very exciting development for the country for sure. So besides bank lending, what role will the private sector play in our infrastructure development goals?
So, of course, the execution has always involved private sector. Like when I say execution, I mean who's the entity which is building the road, or who's the entity which is doing the actual construction of a bridge or a shipping port or a power plant. I mean, of course, these are all private sector contractors, right? So now there's always been a question on what role should private sector have on a discretionary basis, right? And I think that debate has been raging for a long time. We have seen time and again that the privatization of the development of public infrastructure comes with several limitations. Even for projects which have went live, say in urban metro transport in some cities in India, or power plants, power sectors, we know that there have been challenges and there have been long disputes. So the role of the private sector that way has to be calibrated. So when we say public-private partnerships, they need to be deployed. But my view is that the public sector assumes the greater execution risk, keeping things more manageable. And we need to learn from the past experience there. This model of public-private partnership will continue in the sense that the public sector becomes the overall, let's say, the underwriter of the project. while the private sector brings specific execution expertise on, let's say, a technology or construction or maintenance and so on. There's also an ongoing role for the private sector in the asset monetization area, which is where probably it has got a bigger, let's say, play. The brownfield assets which the government has can be leased to the private sector. They pay upfront cash, which is a discounted cash flow which they project from the use of that asset, and then they expand the usage of the asset to the general public while also maintaining it and ensuring the right quality availability is there for the asset. So to give you an example, let's say we have got several large stadiums which people don't use usually in India, and they also fall in derelict many times. I mean, they're not maintained as much as they should. Like, I mean, I lived in Pune. Pune has got this wonderful stadium called Balewadi Stadium, which was built for national games and the Commonwealth Youth Games, I think 13, 14 years ago. But it has not been open in many cases because the local body may not have the money and the resources to fully maintain a proper world-class stadium facility. Right? So basically, if you involve a private party in running it, and you create a usage fee kind of a structure, so the private party gives the governing body some upfront cash, then it maintains those badminton courts or swimming pools and athletic tracks, and then attracts people to via different ways to come and participate and use those facilities for a fee, of course. So it recovers its money which it has paid to the government. It doesn't own the asset. It is essentially running the asset. The ownership still with whatever the government body is, in this case, let's say the municipal corporation. So that kind of structure is what the asset monetization will bring in, which was what was announced by the finance minister in the national asset monetization pipeline. This model also has worked well for, let's say, airports, right? So like in several cases, the Airports Authority of India has formed joint ventures with a private entity. The private entity runs the airports. I think all of us who have been flying for the last, let's say, 20 years will accept that the flying experience in India in the last 10, 12 years has improved significantly, and we what it used to be earlier. And we've had, of course, airports is a special case because there have been private airports also, but in general, the collaboration between AAI and the private sector has increased, and this is another example of asset monetization. So these kind of role will always be there. But if you ask me, like, can private sector build a new 1,000-kilometer highway right from land acquisition to bringing in money to construction? The answer probably is no to that kind of a project.
Right. And then the burning question, of course, is that which private player does get those rights, right? Is there any move by the government to create a more transparent process so that everyone has a fair chance at playing a role in this?
Right. So, Pallavi, I come from a management consulting background. Let me answer this question a little philosophically. Okay. I go back to a very important corporate strategy postulate by a gentleman by the name of Bruce Henderson. Henderson, as you may know, was the founder of the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG as we today know it in popular parlance. So in 1976, he posited a rule which was called the rule of 3 and 4. His theory was that for a stable and a competitive industry, there will never be more than 3 significant generalist players in any industry. And for optimal equilibrium for a large industry, the market share of the 3 players will be in the ratio of 4:2:1, which is why it was called rule of 3 and 4, 3 participants and 40% of the market share for the largest participant typically. This is for generalist players. Of course, there could be some niche players which will have a small market share and may eventually end up merging with one of the larger generalist players. That was possible. This hypothesis has been tested over the years in several industries, including by BCG itself. They actually paid a tribute to 50 years of their founding a few years ago and actually ran backward tests on this hypothesis, and it was generally found correct in hindsight with the data they analyzed. Even in infrastructure development, it is not different. Expecting that more than 3-4 firms in the country will develop full stack, full market capabilities across countless sectors. I mean, infrastructure is a huge problem. So it is impractical to have several large players doing it simultaneously. What matters, as you rightly pointed out, is that the bidding processes should stay transparent, competitive, and robust. And this definitely has been the case in the last few years. Let's probably take a few examples of these situations, right? So let's say where there have been procedural anomalies suspected, the government has itself re-awarded the contracts. For example, look at the ILFS projects. ILFS was a big name in the infrastructure sector, and as we know the story, the firm kind of ran into trouble. And a lot of those, I mean, there was a resolution plan created. Mr. Uday Kotak was helping solve that problem. Again, a big name from the Indian banking industry. So some of these projects do, some of these problems do get resolved. I mean, the unwinding is orderly in that sense. Even in, for example, in J&K, some of the tunneling contracts were re-awarded based on the transparency required. So that is an ongoing process. But if you do see, talking about the niche players, and I can give you some live examples where the niche players have actually been able to break the monopoly of the few large players that whose names we typically keep hearing. In the, let's say, the city gas distribution, which is a new thrust of infrastructure, the whole thrust towards creating India a more gas-based economy, right? So when we are getting piped gas, I mean, it's much more common in Maharashtra and Gujarat probably for several years, but rest of the country hasn't had piped gas as one of the facilities in the urban centers, but that's now changing. So the city gas distribution, a lot of the bids recently has been won by Megha Engineering, which is a relatively smaller firm, but they of course specialize in that, and they have been able to beat some of the larger competitors. Another example is power distribution. A firm like say CESC, which runs several operations in West Bengal, I mean, typically centered around Kolkata, but they also won contracts to run the city power distribution in cities like Kota, Bharatpur, Bikaner. I think that's just from the top of my mind. So I think there will always be some firms which will want to specialize in specific industries, and they may well win against generalist large competitors in those industries because they will always bring superior domain knowledge. But if you ask me, like, can there be 100 full stack infrastructure firms tackling 15, 20 large sectors? Probably the answer is no, because that's not going to be practical, both in terms of managing the financial aspect of the operations and the complexities of the knowledge required.
Okay, so can I push back a little bit on this, on the Henderson argument? So I agree with corporations. When you have like an industry, you because of economies of scale, you end up, a firm with a larger market share can bring per unit cost down, right? So you end up with economies of scale, and then you end up seeing fewer firms. But in an infrastructure setting, like, why can not different players, for instance, have a joint venture with the airports, right? Why is it that there's one entity that runs all the airports in the country as opposed to, let's say, 5 entities?
Right. So the answer to that question, Pallavi, lies in the bidding process. I mean, the bidding is always open, right? For example, look at the Noida airport. I mean, we got an international player consortium led by Zurich Airports there, which won the bid, right? So, of course, all of these questions are also a commercial consideration on the part of the private entities also, right? They will always have their own risk reward matrix. They will have the considerations of what they want to kind of, invest in from their ROI and their ROE perspective, because they are also responsible to their shareholders. So I think the process of new players coming in, I mean, some of the names I told you, I mean, like ILFS was a big name, I mean, which was a very unconventional name for several years, right? But they ran into trouble because of their own, problems of how they finance their projects, the asset liability mismatch and so on. So I think these, in any private sector operation, this will be an ongoing process where you will get new participants depending on the capability which they build. And I really hope that some of the smaller players which are coming into specific things like power sector, shipping industry, defense production, for example, I think let's hope that they scale across the spectrum and enter new industries as well.
Right. Because I mean, I think, I worked on antitrust for a long time. I worked in the antitrust and industry. And I think one of the biggest worries that you have is that, you don't want while we want infrastructure development, we do not want monopolies to develop so that, now you're going to be charged every time you enter the airport, which is already happening right now. You take your car into the airport and you're already charged a fee, right? Like where are the checks and balances on that kind of monopoly power? Is there any kind of push in that direction?
I think we should keep some of the popular criticism away from the structural issues. I mean, like again in Pune, which is an AI airport, you still get charged if you go and park for 30 seconds, right? So even the government does that, or it's an Air Force run airport. So whoever is running the operations on their behalf also does that. It doesn't need to be a private airport to pay for a parking in an airport. So I think some of these are perceptions which are also wrongly developed. I mean, there's a fact that I think the larger question here is who pays for the usage of the infrastructure, right? So when you say when you say public infrastructure, which part of it is free and which part of it is essentially you pay for. So I think that's again a larger philosophical question. I think most countries, until they get to a certain level of development, they obviously charge for the public infrastructure. Even, for example, I live in Switzerland now. I think all public transport is not free in the sense it's actually charged at a fairly competitive rate, and which is how they maintain it. The cities which haven't charged, like say London, for example, I mean their tube network is perennially in problem because one of the issues is they are unable to raise funds. So I think this issue of governments having to get back to charge people will always stay. I mean, there's a limit to what you can do for free. Now, I completely agree that the charging structure cannot lead to monopolies, and I think that's an active consideration. Even via infrastructure, I mean, look at the technology sector today, because there are only 3 or 4 large players which run social networks, say an Alphabet or a Meta, I mean Facebook, Google, and these companies always run into trouble. Microsoft, they always get into trouble with antitrust regulators all over the world, including in India sometimes, or certainly in Europe and in the US also. So this is a very genuine issue. I think the challenge, what happens is that the businesses become big before the regulators kind of catch hold of them. The regulators do always catch hold of antitrust situations, but it typically happens in hindsight. You cannot prevent a company from becoming big just in the expectation that they will become big and do something incorrect. But once they do become big, and in case they indulge in monopoly behavior, that of course is an antitrust problem in most countries, including in India also. So I think my personal sense is we are not there yet. I think the populist commentary runs ahead of its times on some of those issues also sometimes. So I think we should just wait and ensure that there's enough diversity coming in especially in different parts of infrastructure sectors.
Thanks for that. So moving from the private players, that will be part of like the maintenance and creation. What about the role of these contractors? They are different from the private firm. Is that correct? Like a contractor, would they be the same entity as a private entity developing infrastructure, or would they be a separate entity usually?
So this could be a separate entity, Pallavi. Of course, you're right. As you rightly said, there could be multiple levels of private players. So there could be a consortium which has got people who bring in capital. I mean, it's like some private players will specialize in bringing capital. Some will specialize in actual construction. Some will specialize in maintenance. So I think there could be a continuum of players which will join the whole, let's say the chain of command or chain of execution. But I think the role of contractors will become much more prominent in the whole the national asset monetization side, because that is where even the smaller players have an option to really grow if they participate in this program. It's a 6 lakh crore worth of asset monetization, which the government has announced earlier last year. I think it was in July or August. I don't remember the date, around that time. But this is still a central government initiative, though. The assets which are owned by the states or the local bodies are not yet in the program, although the central government is incentivizing them to participate. So let's see if they get involved. But for now, the asset monetization will happen for contractors, and even smaller contractors will be able to participate there because it's a different type of structuring. It's not about huge financial risks in most cases. So, the encouraging part is that the states have in the past taken up similar initiatives. I mean, I spoke about the Rajasthan power distribution, examples. I think Odisha has also done that. Some of the cities in Odisha also have private distribution players. In fact, they have changed also in a couple of cycles. So to your earlier point, I mean, when the bidding process ensured that new players came in when there were some execution challenges. So in that sense, yes, the contractors, the smaller players will maybe different from the larger players, which take the whole, the soup to nuts risk of running a project. There could be other entities involved, but of course, they have to. They'll have to put in some effort to become bigger in their own right and become the more, let's say, the L1 player in the process and not remain subcontractors.
So, but one thing that is classic for India is that everybody builds these big fancy projects, and then a lot stay up and we have safe roads and safe bridges, but they collapse, right? So it seems like there's no accountability built in to the structure. And I think if we're moving in the way of infrastructure, we need these contractors to be accountable.
Absolutely. I think the performance considerations need to be part of the, let's say, the contracting documents itself, where part of the payment. I think the NHI has been doing it for a while. Like, they do have some performance standards on which the last payment is made. So only when the checks and balances are approved, the contractor finally gets the money cleared. I think this kind of a model needs to be in place. Definitely, I completely agree. Also, the challenge, Pallavi, is that, and I think we had spoken about this when we were discussing this program, was that when the more granular you go, maybe this can be done at a national level, right? But when you go to cities, for example, cities don't always have the capability to even have the engineering standards laid down or evaluate projects against a lot of these checks and balances, right? So which is why we see the urban infrastructure tends to be much more problematic than, let's say, the national one, right? So you may have a good highway, but you may not always have a good road in a city, and it's a conundrum to deal with, because you actually use the city road much more often than you use the highway, right? So in that sense, the capability or the capacity which the different entities in the governments have, unfortunately, the cities do not have that capacity to enforce some of it. It can only come from designing model contracts and then enforcing them. And I guess it's a question of trickle down, where it becomes much more common at a national level, then the states adopt it, and then it eventually reaches the local bodies. But it's a bit of a journey there.
Right. So when you say the cities are involved, like, so when we build a road in, let's say, in Mumbai, what role does the state government have? What role does the local government have? Or what kind of role does the central government have? And then the contractor in this mix. So it's a little confusing, like why the state, by the local government. Now, does the BMC have to be involved? Like, is the BMC accountable for the quality of the road?
Yes, absolutely. So in any municipal corporation, the city roads are typically maintained by the municipal corporations, unless they are declared as state highways or national highways, right, which can pass through the cities. And even there's always an agreement as to what part of NH passing through a city will be maintained by a municipal corporation versus maintained by the NHAI or whoever the agency at a national level is. So the local bodies definitely have a role to play in the local infrastructure creation, and not just roads, but also bridges, flyovers over railway crossings. Sort of those projects typically come in the city domain in most cities. Also, the more broader question of creating open spaces, planning, the city planning. I mean, that aspect of infrastructure is also within the municipal corporation, and I think that is where the challenge really lies for India, which is that each city has got very different levels of capacity in terms of what let's say the domain expertise needed for the planning aspects, the political and the administrative will needed to enforce the plan. I mean, you can create a plan, but then there could be pulls and pressures to essentially change it based on various considerations. So I think some of that varies widely across cities. I think it's a challenge, definitely. If state or the national government start playing bigger role, there could be questions of federalism which might come into play as to why are you not giving autonomy to a city. On the contrary, the cities then need to demonstrate that they are upping their game and increasing their own execution capacity, which is also probably happening in bits and in some fits and starts and in some pockets, but not necessarily very in a very uniform way, and certainly not happening for all the cities anyway. So of course, the one debate is that how do you elect city officials? The one theory is that if you elect them directly, then there's more accountability. Today in India, the municipal corporations, I mean, we do have polls, but the power is always distributed between the administrative part, which is the bureaucracy, which runs the municipal corporation. It's the same as a state or a country actually, but essentially there's a elected part of the government and there's the administrative part of the government. And how well they coordinate, how they come together to deliver results. I think it's a challenge. I mean, I originally come from Indore, so I'm a bit positive on that, because Indore, when I grew up versus what I see today, I mean, it's a very different city. And one of the reasons is that the political class and the administrative setup has come together really well, and to really improve the city in terms of cleanliness and to structure it and to kind of give it a more usable shape. And anyone who has lived in the city in 80s and 90s can now testify that in the last 10, 12, 15 years, it has really changed. So there are positive examples also. It's not that there's all criticism, but the challenge in India is how do you take the best practices to other cities? Will they adopt it? Will they learn? Will they have the appetite to learn? Will the people stand up to the occasion? I think those are the questions which are widely different in terms of the capability to execute.
Thank you. So this gives me, this is a good segue into my next question, is like in these local elections, like how much of this matters to voters? Like, you build a road in Bombay, there's one monsoon and you've got potholes again, right? It's like you're never without potholes in Bombay, so like, do voters care about this or not? I mean, does it matter?
It's a very difficult question, by the way, to answer. I mean, how India votes is probably it's a research topic for academia to kind of deep dive into as to how people think. Clearly, it seems to matter in some places. I mean, depending on just empirically, I'm saying that where things have improved, those people have also been rewarded. On the contrary, there are also examples where things improved and the people were still penalized for different reasons. I mean, for other reasons potentially, right? So maybe there's not a one-to-one correlation between what you say, which is to deliver a specific piece of infrastructure versus, let's say, a political choice which the voters make. I think ultimately the solution here is the better coordination between the city officials, both political and administrative. Also, cities have to raise resources. There are very few avenues today for cities to get money from, right? I mean, it's a trickle down which happens from central to the state and then state to the cities. Sometimes, of course, there are central programs which fund specific projects directly in cities, like, say, transportation improvement, or we had Amrut as one of the concepts, or smart cities. So there could be pockets of investments which might come in directly from, let's say, center or from the state. But I think cities raising their own resources is one of these solutions potentially. We have been talking about municipal bonds for a while. Some cities have actually footed them also for specific projects. I think, again, from what I remember, Pune, Ahmedabad had instances of these bonds. They were also listed on the stock exchange for people to kind of participate in the process. But again, these were very small tranches which were issued and for very small projects for very specific reasons, right? Cities need to, I mean, look at a city like Mumbai. It's got a budget of what, 39,000 crores, I guess, which is larger than some of the smaller states in the country, right? So the money which is needed to run cities of that size is also humongous. I mean, we're talking about at least 8,000-10,000 crores for a lot of large cities. Let's say the top 8-10 cities in India at the minimum. I mean, Mumbai is, of course, still very different, but even 8,000-10,000 crores is a big amount for a city to raise. And unless they have access to that, and this is, by the way, every year. I mean, this is not a one-time outlay. I mean, this is a money which is needed every year to run the city properly. So how do you essentially, get this resource? I think that's a question. Again, the municipal bond question has been out on the table for a while, and I'm at this stage not sure if that's something going to be generally adopted. And if yes, then what are the terms and conditions in terms of what part of it is underwritten by the sovereign, what part is, what happens in case of a default, right? What is the unwinding process there? Because if the other challenge there is that if the bonds are underwritten by the state or the central government, then there's no incentive to really, perform the task which you are promising, because the risk is, you ultimately know that if you don't do it, someone sitting in the capital or someone sitting in Delhi will have to essentially bail you out. So again, there's a moral hazard problem there also. So open question, but I think funding is a critical part to resolve apart from the process aspect of it.
So they won't have any recourse to this National Bank for Finance and Infrastructure Development. They won't be getting funds from there, the cities.
They can. It won't be grants though. I mean, they'll have to. They can propose projects and then they can approach NAPFID like any other project. But it's not in the form of grants where the bank just says, oh, take 100 crores and do, that's not going to happen.
Sure. Okay. So recently I just read that in Bombay, the BMC, I mean, with the upcoming election, now they're offering like anti-mosquito fogging, as well as like pressure cookers and other kitchen appliances. So the netas are using some type of public infrastructure. There's a movement towards that at least. So that's encouraging, so it seems like local voters do care about, mosquitoes, mosquito abatement. Okay, so you mentioned Amrut, which is this umbrella of infrastructure projects aimed at the urban areas, which is actually very exciting. But the only question that I have on this is that, will it not create perverse incentives where we see massive migration from rural areas to living in the urban areas, like the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, which is to provide housing for individuals, right? If you're guaranteed housing, of course, you're going to leave the rural areas, mass migration into the urban areas. So is the government also thinking of parallel rural development projects at the same scale in order to keep kind of the economy in equilibrium?
Yeah, no, I think great point, Pallavi. My view is that we should use positive impulses and drivers to solve the problems of inequity rather than hold out negative promises, right? So there's no point in not letting a city develop because there could be more people migrating. I mean, it's a different problem. It's a different problem. The city dwellers should be entitled to good infrastructure. But of course, the rural population should also get the benefit of the facilities. If someone wants to choose to live in a rural area, someone wishes to live a rustic, quiet, less frantic life, they should have the right facilities where they are in situation. So yes, in fact, since you mentioned the PM Awas Yojana also has a Grameen part to it, which is creating houses exactly like how it's doing in the cities. In fact, again, it's the same process. Each state submits a list of beneficiaries. There's a budget allocated to each state depending on its complexities and necessities, and then basically the state runs with the part of the execution. So yes, it is happening there also. Also, if you look at highways going through more unusual parts. I think one challenge in India has been that all highways typically follow a set path. I mean, let's say a geographic path, which then incentivizes cities to assimilate around that one known area of geography. So I think that is also changing. If you see some of the new highways, like there's a proposal for an Amritsar Jamnagar highway. There's something the New Delhi Mumbai highway goes from a different route, not via the usual, not to the usual cities. It takes a detour in Gujarat and then goes via the less developed parts of MP and Rajasthan. There's a Surat Chennai highway which passes through relatively undeveloped parts of the Marathwada area, Khandesh Marathwada region in Maharashtra, for example, North Telangana. So I think I think some of these initiatives are useful because they also connect the villages. I mean, you can live in a relatively small place and still be able to reach a city for a healthcare need or an education need, and let's say a travel time of 1-2 hours in some cases, right? So I think this kind of solves some of the issues which you mentioned, and it's a dual approach to solve the inequity problem. But I think more philosophically, the cities will remain the drivers of economic growth. I mean, it's not just true in India, but it's also true globally. If you see, say, UK, London today accounts for 22% of UK's GDP, roughly 22-25%. I mean, the population is a little less than that, right? So people do live outside, but they come to London to work, or London just produces more in terms of higher productivity. If you look at US, California and New York, the two largest states, which are extremely urbanized, and of course, they've got fairly large cities to drive their economy. I think from what I remember, California has 15% contribution to US GDP and New York is about 8%. certainly their population is much less than that. So California doesn't house 15% of US population. New York doesn't house 8% of US population, but just those two states is like 22%, 22, 23% of US GDP. So the urban centers driving economic growth is absolutely normal, and it will continue to happen world over, especially true of India also. But yes, it shouldn't be that this comes at the cost of neglecting the rural infrastructure. And I think some of the programs like the Gramin Awas Yojana and the network of new highways which are being built under Bharatmala program, I think some of that should hopefully also improve the lives of the rural dwellers in terms of access to the cities, not just life in situation, but also as a matter of choice. If someone wants to live in rural area and or relatively, as we call urban areas, the Indian term, outskirts of cities, and then they still commute to get whatever they want to get it done in the cities.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of like infrastructure, you're talking about California and New York. I mean, you go outside the cities, but there's still like 24 hours power, and there's still 24 hours water. Like you get hot water by the turn of a tap. You know what I mean? So we still have a ways to go before we can, I mean, urban areas are fine, but we've got to take care of the peri-urban and rural areas as well, in terms of if we want to grow as a country.
Indeed, absolutely. I think some of the human indicators are, I mean, when we talk about infrastructure, there's a basic infrastructure which is needed, right? And what is that basic infrastructure? I mean, it is quality of healthcare, quality of education, water access to sanitation. I mean, of course, these are very pertinent questions, and you can make any number of highways, but if you don't have drinking water, I mean, ultimately it's not going to help the population which is living in a backward part. I think the Jal Jeevan mission is doing a great job there. I mean, let's hope that like the way we access, the way we improve the power access and access to cooking fuels, which has certainly been a great story of the last 5-6 years. I think that the Jal Jeevan mission should replicate that for the drinking water also. Again, water in general is a precious resource in India. I mean, we don't have as much water bodies to start off, freshwater bodies relative to the population that we support. I think we have got 5% of global fresh water versus 17% of the population. So that inequity needs bigger planning also in terms of the projects which will ensure safe drinking water and so on. But absolutely correct. I think the infrastructure is not just about hard infrastructure; it's also about very basic amenities of life, which typically we may take granted in the cities, but may not be the case in the rural parts.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So the last question, because we're we've got about 2 minutes left. So how do we hold the builders of these projects environmentally and socially responsible? Right? Like, are you raising a forest to the ground to build your highway? Are you destroying the livelihoods of villagers when we're building highways and we're building dams? And I mean, we've faced this issue before, and we're facing it less now, which is great. I think there's more power of individuals now to protest against such acquisition of land and other kinds of bodies. So, I mean, in this entire scheme of infrastructure development, we need to have a body that kind of, holds everybody accountable, so to speak.
So we don't have an overarching body. I mean, the questions which you raised, the environment clearances come from the Ministry of Environment and Forest. They do have a specific process laid down to evaluate every project. And in fact, the environment clearance is a must for any project. It's a part of the clearance needed for launching anything at all in India. And as you rightly pointed out, there's been a shift towards more, let's say, objective ways of looking at these issues. On the other part is that maybe when the financing, when we start tapping into international finances more often, there would be a need to align with certain level of environmental consciousness and a planning towards in that area. India is committed to a net zero target itself by 2070. And what that means is that we ourselves will need projects which will be more environmentally conscious and environmentally, less emitting, less polluting, right? So the investments that also happen will also happen in projects which are more environmental friendly in that sense. And hence the way you structure them also will need much more, let's say, involvement of environmental questions. So I think some of that is an ongoing issue and will probably, develop. I think the problem, Pallavi, has been that we have always caught up with infrastructure, right? We don't build anything. We haven't historically built anything in advance of when it was needed. If you take a city like Mumbai, I mean, take London, for example. London and Mumbai are very similar cities. London has got 6 airports, right? And Mumbai is still struggling for a second airport. I mean, it's been on for a long time. The first study was done in 1995, which also was delayed by in itself. But even in 2022, I mean, the airport is still being constructed. So, Mumbai has got 1 runway or active on the main airport. And, sometimes people take pride that it is the busiest airport in the country. The 1,000 flights operations happen per day. I think before pandemic, there was a record that 1,003 flight operations happened on a single runway in 24 hours. Some people thought it was a matter of pride. I mean, you should actually think of it as a matter of risk that, if you are pushing 1,000 flights a day, it puts so much risk, so much pressure on the air traffic control and the whole airport operation management teams out there, right? On a day-to-day basis. These are human lives involved. You cannot, get into any error of any kind at all. So I think the challenge also is that the infrastructure, some of these questions which you mentioned, they would not have arose if the infrastructure was planned ahead of time. When we are catching up, then the options to locate something are also limited. I mean, once the city is built up, where do you find a place to build an airport, right? So I think those questions, hopefully, I mean, if the other cities, the smaller cities learn from these experiences and invest ahead of time, they still have a chance before they have to disturb someone else's livelihood, and better planning is needed. And I really hope that at least on the road side, on railways, some of these questions are getting better. I mean, we are planning ahead, and I think that's a good thing. But it's a journey again. Once we bridge the infrastructure gap, maybe in 15, 20 years, hopefully with some trust, some of these questions will become less pertinent, and that would be a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much. Now I will invite questions. So there were a lot of questions in the chat box. So in that order, I would like to call Professor Himani Bakshi, if she can unmute and ask a question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful session and discussion. I was looking at these issues of infrastructure and the challenges from mainly the PPP framework that are available in India. You mentioned about Delhi airport, and we also had seen Hyderabad airport running in PPP, where actually the private party suffers, initially, because a lot of challenges from either land acquisition, the employees, users, sharing of revenue, and now a lot of such infrastructure responsibilities are coming on to the local government, and they also need to rely on the PPP. We have been hearing a lot about updates and amendments and improvements in the PPP, model PPP framework that are available. But then what do you see, what needs to be done on these grounds? Because in India, land is always going to be scarce, and the private party suffers a lot. And then adding on to that, all the other issues of environmental clearance, revenue sharing comes up. So what are your views regarding these?
So I think I would tackle that in 2 different parts. Firstly, I would say that any process where the private party becomes responsible for land acquisition is not going to work in India. It is very clear. The reasons are because the land acquisition is a political domain question. It is not a procedural question. Even if you follow all the laid out processes, including compensation, including guaranteeing the environmental assessment which has to be done, the impact assessment, the social impact assessment, even if all of that is followed, the question will always remain in the political domain. So any PPP which centers around the private party, let's say acquiring land, is not going to be successful. I think that's been proven time and again, and I think the good thing is it's also been accepted that way. What would mean in the PPP is to the ideal PPP will have to share that risk in an equitable way, where the public sector essentially underwrites the entire end-to-end execution, while the private sector comes and fits. I mean, it's like a plug and play kind of operation where you plug the private sector for specific reasons, that they've got competence in procuring something, or competence in building a part of a road, or designing a bridge, or I think that part can work very well. Again, the challenge is that you can have a model PPP, but like there are model acts for a lot of things, but doesn't mean that each state will adopt it in its true letter and spirit, right? So the PPP also only works where there's a control of a single administrative unit, a department, a machinery, a ministry or a department and so on. But I agree, we do need the model PPP also exists. It's just that the application of it is also kind of non-uniform depending on different situations. But the focus has to move away from the private sector getting involved in the clearance aspect of things. Only then the process can move forward.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Professor Sonal Yadav to ask a question, if she can unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Aashish and Pallavi, for that engaging conversation. So my question is, there are two questions. So one is build, operate, transfer model of PPP efficient enough to start the stalled project? As we know, all national highway construction projects, they work under this BOT model, we call it. So is this model be equally efficient in other stalled projects? And other is, what are the ways to encourage investment in rural infrastructure? Because private players are not interested in small projects, and whether we can have a bigger project for rural infrastructure building also. And if yes, then how to encourage that?
Right. So the BOT structure, as I said, can only work after the land is available. I mean, if you are doing a BOT, I mean, when it starts with build and not with the act of planning that project, I think that then it can still work. The challenge happens when the private party takes the whole risk of the clearance part of it. So that is, of course, it's not tenable in the Indian context. Rural projects, I think, absolutely right. A lot of the small ticket size projects are not going to be attractive for large companies to go and execute. What is needed is a devolution of funds. And I mean, what I mentioned with Pallavi's in the conversation with Pallavi on the cities not able to raise funds. The problem is more acute in rural areas, right? I mean, how would Gram Panchayats raise funds if cities themselves cannot do that? So I think the challenge there is to get the devolution of funds at a local level and build execution capacity for these Gram Panchayats. So I think that's a job for the state governments too, because again, a Gram Panchayat cannot become an expert in building a small road or a rivulet or like a local irrigation project. Not each Panchayat can have that kind of a diverse skill set. So again, this is where the states come into play. They need to have the planning and the domain competencies needs to stay in the capitals, but the money needs to reach the villages to really execute some of those local requirements.
Right. Thank you. But then there is always a problem of quality and how to, maintain it if the state is taking the responsibility in rural infrastructure.
Yes, absolutely. But again, India is such a vast country. I mean, there are parts which I don't think there'll be a private participation feasible in several projects in deep interiors. I mean, that has to be from the state. Because you can't monetize things, right? Like you cannot plan for monetization of very small projects through external participation. So I think there will be some situations where the participation of government is both inevitable and also necessary.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Now I would like to invite Darshan Desai to ask his question. Darshan, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Well, I was listening to the whole thing. I can see that infrastructure is really a very, very wide issue. It just doesn't involve how do you fund the projects. It just doesn't involve how you fund the projects. But what I am noticing is that there is a lopsided view of infrastructure development. Whenever there is a reference of infrastructure developments, the talk is more about roads and bridges. Okay, and the roads and bridges largely point towards developing the same for real estate sector and for industrial sector growth. Okay, so there are two aspects. One is we talked about, you made a very good point that we may make excellent highways, But when you come to the cities, the cities are in a very bad shape. So we are bringing the cities closer, but we are also creating a kind of an urban chaos. Like if you look at Ahmedabad, we're talking about one monsoon and it gets flooded, Ahmedabad gets worse. Ahmedabad, the number of water bodies are reducing. By what? We had some more than 200 water bodies 20 years ago. Now we have some 60, 70 of them. So you're basically building on drainage systems, you're building on sewage systems, you're choking up this system. So this is not just about Ahmedabad. We are not building that urban living infrastructure. What we are doing is we are just building the highways. That was one point. But another thing is, don't you think there needs to be a paradigm shift towards government's priorities about infrastructure development? By paradigm shift, I mean, don't you think there should be more focus on social infrastructure? For example, the country has seen the worst ever health crisis, and which is continuing for more than 2 years. So I don't see any sense of urgency in creating a proper health infrastructure, which the advantage of which can be taken even at the up to the last village. If I speak of Ahmedabad, in the area where I live, in a radius of 4 to 5 kilometers, there are 8 cancer hospitals, private cancer hospitals, all private sector, and obviously we know the cost of treatment at these places. Similarly, the education scenario, so many, we have a problem of classrooms. We have similarly, I mean, look at education, look at health. These are very basic things. So don't you think there's a need for a paradigm shift at how you look at infrastructure development? Can we give a break to the highways and look at developing the villages so that we reduce migration? And we look at creative ways of strengthening agriculture so that we reduce migration and improve the overall living. Right now, we are creating chaotic cities, because like if you talk about Gujarat, there's a huge urbanization happening. The peri-urban areas, all villages around Ahmedabad are part of the Ahmedabad city. And whenever you have elections around the corner, you extend the limits of the municipal corporation, while you don't increase the number of municipal wards, that is the constituencies. So you have more population coming within the same area and putting pressure on the same infrastructure of a municipal corporation. Yeah,
I get the gist, sir. I think I get the gist of the question. In the interest of time, let me pick up 2 points there from what you mentioned. See, on the cities being the drivers of economy, I think we need to accept. I think this is a very romantic concept that let villages be better so that people don't move. That's not going to happen. World over, historically, for millenniums, only cities drive an economy, whether it is India, outside India, now 5,000 years ago. I mean, just on a philosophical note, when we talk about the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization, we talk about Harappa, Lothal, Mohenjo-daro, Rakhi-Gadi. Why? Because these were cities of those times. You don't remember the names of the hamlets which existed in small pockets, right? So cities have always existed. As I told Pallavi, London, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they are all the drivers of their local economy. That's not going to change. So to say that we should do something so that people don't migrate, I think that's just that's an impractical perspective in my view. What needs to be done is let people come and let people choose what they want to do, but give them the right facilities where they want to use those facilities, whether it's in the cities or whether it's in the villages or in the rural areas. So that definitely is a genuine concern, and I think you're right that the social infrastructure is also very critical. Now, on the healthcare, now we are talking about building a medical college in every district. The fact is we don't have, how many medical colleges does India have? You'll be surprised to know that many districts forget about, villages. The district headquarters doesn't have a medical college. And by medical college, as we know in India, college is always associated with a hospital. So we don't have a hospital plus college combination, right? The number of seats in medical education has been severely artificially curtailed for years by vested interests. people who used to control one of the reforms which happened was to the whole governance of medical education is now changing, right? In the sense that we're no longer looking at a quasi-private body deciding how many seats should be allotted to medical education. So when you say healthcare, yes, I mean, of course, unless you have doctors, unless you have professors, unless you have actually got hospitals, why do people come to Ahmedabad? Why are there 8 cancer hospitals in Ahmedabad? Because the problem is that 100 kilometers away from Ahmedabad, you cannot get treated for cancer. And the challenge there is that there were no doctors there, or there were no medical institutions there, right? And which is why you have to kind of migrate. So I think these are the issues which same for, let's say, access to healthcare. Like Ayushman Bharat Yojana was precisely that, right? It may not have reached the social strata where you and I live, but I mean, the fact is that it is actually helping people. There are 50 crore odd intended 500 crore odd intended beneficiaries of Ayushman Bharat Yojana. It will, I get my numbers completely incorrect. 50 crore beneficiaries of Ayushman Bharat Yojana, and I think that's where the thrust has been, that at least the people who are unable to access healthcare, they kind of are subsidized by the government. But the challenge is that the country is so vast that by the time it reaches us, or where you need intervention, and we may need intervention at a different price point, or at a different types of illnesses or different types of lifestyle problems, it will take a while. It's not, but I think some of the changes that's happening, certainly on healthcare, it is happening, beginning to happen now. Education should follow with the national education policy, which was put into play. But in general, I absolutely agree with your point that infrastructure need not be limited to hard infrastructure. We need to look at what is called the human infrastructure, or the human capital, which is what will really make a difference over a period of time. Because unless people themselves have better access to improving their own personal lives, they won't be able to fully productively use what is being built around them. So I think that remains a genuine issue, and I think an area of ongoing work.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Kishan Shah to ask his question. Kishan, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the insights. Sir, Ashish, sir, I had this question on the technology front. So what kind of technological advancement does the infrastructure companies in India need to do so that, I mean, which is seen out of India, but it's not yet adopted in India?
So yeah, thanks Kishan for the question. Thanks also for expanding the full form of ICICI. I say that in the chat you had mentioned that. So on the technology side, I think technology can be a great driver. When we talk about infrastructure, India is seeing a boom of what we call the public digital goods or public digital infrastructure, right? So a platform like, say, CoWIN is also a public infrastructure. Aadhaar, Jandhan, Bheem, the whole payment ecosystem that India has developed via UPI, that is also part of the digital infrastructure. So technology can certainly make a big difference. I think the next big intervention, Kishan, could be on the healthcare side, where and also this whole the community of the electronic commerce that is being built. I think those two could be the big areas of intervention, which could help improve logistics when it comes to commerce. And healthcare, health access, health record visibility, plus the accessibility when it comes to the accessing healthcare at a low cost. And also more fungibly across the country wherever you are. So those two could be a big area of technology interventions going forward.
Right, sir. So just a follow-up question on that. Apart from those, technological advancements in the road infrastructure is what I would like to know more on. Right.
So there, of course, the road building technology itself keeps improving. The involvement of machines. You might have seen, if you are following the construction of the Delhi-Mumbai, the new expressway, the new highway, there some of the large machines are being used, right, which are like rapid. They lay the roads much more rapidly than what the traditional methods used to be. Mm-hmm. So there the technology manifests in two parts. One is the kind of machinery which you are using. Secondly, how you're monitoring them, right? So using of drones, for example, collecting data which is geotagged in nature, where you can understand that there's a problem, or let's say there's a breakdown, or like some pothole has got created because of some issue. a lot of that monitoring and maintenance can involve technology very, very easily, actually. I mean, flying drones over a few kilometers stretch and a swarm of drones, for example, monitoring the let's say the situation is actually very much feasible, practically feasible. So I think in the whole maintenance, monitoring, inspection aspect of things, technology will play a big part while the project is being implemented, also for live projects.
Okay, sir, got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kishan. I would like to ask a question on behalf of Viren. He said that infrastructure financing is a huge challenge. Sometime back, there was a thought about financing it through foreign exchange reserves. Is there a possibility? Is it possible in India? That is the question that he.
Right. Thanks, Virenji. I think, see, some of it is also, this is more of a macroeconomic question. Let me not give a personal view there. I mean, this is something which is in the policy domain, which happens every year in the budget times. And since we are close to that, so let me not speculate on that one. But I think what is necessary is to create a viable model of asset liability mismatch when it comes to infrastructure. If you use your own domestic assets, whether they are foreign reserves or of any other variety, the challenges it needs to be backed. Those assets, I mean, those resources need to have sufficient lifespan, so as to when they flow back into your coffers, they will only flow back in 10, 15, 20, 30 years when the infrastructure project that you are building is live and is paying you back. So I think the question here is more on the philosophical issue of the asset liability mismatch, not so much as to where the money will come from per se. Remember that some of the foreign reserves, these are like there are different types of reserves, right? So the money comes in, it goes out. So you have to match that tenure in which the money stays in India and then use it productively of any nature. So that is a more fundamental question. And I think as we discussed NAPFID, etc., some of that takes care of at least that part of the planning.
Thank you. In fact, recently in the World Economic Forum meeting, a report was released about this adding nature back to the urban areas and focusing on urban infrastructure. And there is a student, Vaishnavi, she has the similar question. Vaishnavi, can you come on camera and ask a question?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. That was a wonderful session. Thank you for it. So my question is that I think someone already pointed it out. And you mentioned that cities are the drivers of economic growth, and we cannot, get away from that fact. Even though the idea of rural areas being hubs of development might be, a little romanticized. We have seen that even urban agglomeration has its own problems, be it environmental issues, be it the growth of slums, be it how much pressure it puts on the resources. So given that we have also committed to net zero emissions, is it time to radically change the way we think about infrastructure itself and focus on rural infrastructure right now rather than growing cities through urban agglomeration? So what are your thoughts on that? And also, how do we, while India is a growing country in terms of industry as well as infrastructure, and we are committing to such a huge net zero emission, that's a commitment that we have made, which is quite huge for us. How do we accommodate it in urban planning in this sense? So these are my two questions.
Sure. So Vaishnavi, I think honestly these are the questions which will be answered in the next 5 to 10 years. Actually, the net zero commitment was just made literally like 2 months ago, and how that manifests itself into planning policies at all levels of government, central, state, local bodies, I think that is a process which has not yet started. The specific commitments are around emissions, about reducing the intensity of the economy, which is of course a more central problem, let's say. It needs participation from all stakeholders, but it can be envisioned at a central level, which is what it has been done in terms of setting up a renewable energy target or saying that, you will use certain type of fuel mix and so on. So I think that is of course happening. Urban planning tied to net zero, I mean, I think it's an evolving area. I actually don't see that would be resolved in the next, let's say, 1 or 2 years. It's like a 5 or 10 year thing. And this is exactly why the net zero target, we have kept a cushion for ourselves, because our industrialization started much later than other countries. I mean, if you see the European world, typically the emissions started rising in 1850s. While India wasn't industrialized until after independence. I mean, even after independence, it took a bit of a time for industries to catch up, right? When all the steel plants were set up and when the government started working on large projects. So truly speaking, India's industrial journey is only started in 1960s, for example, in practical terms. Whatever existed before that was very sporadic and very incidental. So which is why our net zero target is also 2070. We will need the space to ensure that the poverty is first eliminated. We address the issues of economic inequities to ensure proper facilities to all our citizens, and work on environment in parallel, but it's going to take longer because we started late than others. So in the same vein, the issues that, let's say, other cities are dealing with in terms of linking environment to urban planning, I think that consciousness will seep into our planning and in our thought process maybe in a few years' time, once these issues become more live and when it translates into, I mean, right now it is a vision. When it translates to project level, you will see more of those discussions coming in. So we are still a few years away from that, but it's going to happen definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Pallavi for closing remarks and take any other question if she has.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up the, some of the questions that were asked, and, the poverty and equity issues cannot be addressed if we don't take into account the social infrastructure, like Darshan Bhai had mentioned, and as Aashish had also agreed, that there are different aspects of infrastructure, and it's kind of enthralling to see Vaishnavi also, who is a student of economics at Ahmedabad University, bringing up these issues. So while the environment is also important, as Aashish said, we also have to care about poverty and equity, which is part of which will get affected as we grow infrastructure. And I think we need to focus on social infrastructure as well. Thank you so much, Aashish, for this enthralling conversation. We are all wiser as a result of it. And we really hope to interact with you again in the near future.
Thank you so much, Pallavi and Ahmedabad University, for inviting me. I think this was a fascinating discussion, and I really like the format which you had. I'll also look back and check the previous episodes of your discussions on other topics. Thank you so much. Privileged to be here.
Thank you so much, Aashish, for saying that, and take care.